Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thanks so much for tuning in this evening. I'm pretty sure that the Norton Committee at Harvard made an enormous mistake when they asked me to do this lecture series, and it was really my own sense of the absurd that made me want to say yes. So in that spirit, I'll begin. But once, right before I was going to do a concert, I was on stage testing a couple of cables just last minute, and the promoter of the festival came on stage and he said to me, "Is Lonnie here? I'm so excited to meet her. I'm such a Lonnie fan." And I suddenly realized that he thought that he'd booked Laurie Anderson. And I should have said, "No, I'm Laurie Anderson. There's been a misunderstanding. I'm doing the show tonight, and it's called Stories from the Nerve Bible, and it's, stories and violin and ideas and electronic music." But his eyes were glazing over, and I didn't want to disappoint him. So I said, "Wait right here. I think she might be out in her trailer. I'll go check in the trailer. I'll be right back." Lonnie was not in her trailer. There was no trailer. No trailer at all. And so I just hid out for a while and hoped the whole thing would just blow over. Do you know what I mean? What war is this? What time is it? There will be 6 lectures in the series, Spending the War Without You, so welcome to the first one, called The River. Now, first of all, I'm not in Cambridge. I'm in my studio in New York City on the West Side, right next to the Hudson River. But I always dreamed of living in San Francisco and having a late-night radio show that would air around like 4 a.m., just before drive time, a time when most of the listeners were half asleep or trying to get back to sleep, a time when reality and dreams just sort of merge, and it's hard to tell the difference between them. And on the show, I'd play a mixture of obscure music and some wild music and some experimental things and tell these really long stories and then drive back home in the fog. Now, a few months into the pandemic, I finally got a chance to do a late-night radio show. And I DJ'd the show myself in a little studio near the woods where I was living at the time. And since I was doing the engineering, there was a constant sound of keyboard clacking going on in the background while I was trying to get these various homemade computer programs to work. So it wasn't really as mellow and dreamy as I'd imagined. You'll probably hear a lot of this background clacking this evening as we go on. Anyway, we were broadcasting from Middletown, Connecticut, and the show was called Party in the Bardo. Now, the Bardo, according to Tibetans, is the 49-day period immediately after death, when the consciousness prepares to enter another life form. And it's a time of chaos and shock and change and fear. And sometimes the Tibetans also refer to life as the Bardo, as another kind of Bardo. But radio turned out to be the perfect medium for the pandemic. It's intimate, somehow it's off the grid, a little bit like radio in wartime. It's secretive. You have to search for it, you have to tune it in. Plus, radio is slow, it's long-winded. So there were 11 shows, and they'll be back on the air this spring if you'd like to tune in. Still in the 4 a.m. time slot, which definitely culls a lot of listeners. And when the pandemic hit, I was so startled and somehow happy. Wow, the whole planet is suddenly instant Buddhists. And it became a really good time to do improv, music that happens in the moment with no plan and a structure that just gradually evolves as you play. Of course, the best improv is when you play with other people and you build something together. And I always imagine it's like we're building a giant ship in the air, and it appears out of nowhere, made of notes, and you can turn it around and move it and then just make it disappear. The pandemic is also a perfect time for reading. So, for example, if you're reading a book and you get to the bottom of the page and you realize, I have no idea what I just read. And so you just go right back to the top and you read it again. But time these days can also seem so mirage-like. You're walking along towards the future, and out there are all these things in the distance, and people and projects and places, and you keep walking towards them, but instead of getting bigger and closer, these things keep getting smaller and farther away as they get canceled, rescheduled, canceled again, finally, just erased. And it becomes an act of faith to keep going forward. What Fassbinder film is it? The one-armed man walks into a flower shop and says, "What flower expresses days go by, and they just keep going by endlessly, pulling you into the future. Days go by, endlessly pulling you into the future." And the florist says, "White lily." I have to tell you that in these lectures, I'm not going to be explaining my work or describing who I am as an artist. In fact, I don't care if you know who I am. I've never really tried to express myself through my work. It's more about curiosity about how things are, what they are. Plus, I've really made an effort for most of my life to just get rid of the idea of being anyone at all. But starting is always the hard part. It's easy to get nervous about getting off on the wrong foot. It's why, for example, people stutter only at the beginning of the word, when they're starting the word. Nobody ever stutters at the end of the word. There's no stuttering, because by then, it's too late to be afraid. I've also never been good at endings. Wrapping things up is very difficult and artificial. It's why I never have intermissions in my shows, because then I'd have to figure out two beginnings and two endings.
However, I should say I'm going to call these things talks instead of lectures. Why? Because I'm not a writer, I'm a talker. It drives me crazy to hear punctuation. Yes, dreams are the music of the pause, the beating of my heart. Tick, 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 the tempo of music. The tempo, dot, the pounding dash, quote unquote, of my heart.
So, these talks will basically be a series of questions, and we'll start out with two tonight. First question is, why do anything? And the second question is, how do you know what's good? And I'll be looking at these two questions and trying to understand them by talking about music and the river and the body. But like many things these days, it's easy to get sidetracked For example, when I'm writing with programs like speech to text or autocorrect, there are so many kind of techno whirlpools that you can just fall into. And recently, I was trying to write about vicarious crying. And this wasn't a phrase in my computer's vocabulary, in its keyboard dictionary, and so it stubbornly insisted on autocorrecting vicarious crying to ocarinas, and also trying to correct the word vicarious with the words vicinities and vicious. And by the time I got to the end of the sentence, I didn't know what I was writing about anymore. And then I remembered that ocarina app that came out in 2008. And maybe you remember this one. You just blow into your phone and you can choose between a few different modes. And then you can go to the globe mode and you can see the Earth from outer space, and you can spin the Earth around and you can see all the other people who are playing ocarinas at that very moment. And their songs are beaming up and out into the darkness. And I remember playing ocarina nonstop when I got that app. And I felt kind of like a shepherd playing with all the other shepherds from around the world, just playing ocarinas and looking up at the stars. So when I got the ocarina app out again after 13 years, there were still a few people playing ocarina, although not that many comparatively. And meanwhile, there are hundreds of new apps using the spinning globe model. And these globes illustrate things like the rapidly increasing rate of Arctic melt, or rising temperatures, or the diverted Gulf Stream, or disasters of all kinds that have all been escalating in the last decade. Anyway, by the time I finished looking at all the different globes, I was feeling sort of panicked. And we live in a time when there's all the time in the world, and also in a world when time seems to be running out, rushing forward towards something that we just can't imagine. Last December 8th was the 40th anniversary of John Lennon's death. And it was a big anniversary since Lennon was 40 when he died. And so, from this day forward, he'd be dead for longer and longer and longer than he was alive. And by live, I'm not counting the eons before he was born, because there can't be a state of no John Lennon before John Lennon brings himself into being. This, however, is another subject altogether. But let's just say it was a celebration of a milestone in the afterlife. Time goes forward with you or without you. The first record that I owned was a 45, and it must have been given to me by a relative, maybe an uncle, since I was maybe only like 4 or 5 at the time, and I wasn't going to record stores. And it was called Letters from Daddy, and it was the voice of a man reading a letter to his daughter. And once in a while, there were explosions, so there was obviously a war going on. And there were lots of long pauses, like he was looking out over the edge of the trench, or like I was supposed to be saying things to him also. And it was the first time that I realized that records were a collaboration between the performer and the listener, both of them getting lost in the sound. Half a century later, this art form has a really unfortunate title: spoken word art. And the most tone-deaf title of an art form ever. I mean, no one calls novels written word art. So no, I'm counting on writers and critics to come up with a more apt name for this, like a snappier one. Meanwhile, just a word about the title of this series, Spending the War Without You. I've used the word war because when I walk around right now in the early spring of 21, it looks like there's been a war. So many buildings are closed, and places I used to go to all the time, Lincoln Center, the Met, libraries, Broadway, movie theaters, clubs, venues, concert halls, are all closed. And people are shivering outside every night in these makeshift restaurants. And the war, that's been going on for 4 years, or maybe many, many more, has been raging, really, as words. And it was Freud who said, civilization began the first time an angry person cast a word instead of a rock. But words can start wars too. Remember the culture wars? They were about taste. He liked hip-hop. She liked classical. He liked country music. She liked opera. Then, a little later, she thought rap was radical. And he thought it was obscene. You kind of thought the culture war was just a metaphor. This could never be a real war, could it? Whose war is this? What time is it? But you know, the word war is such a worn-out word. War has become background, a constant state, a given. We don't declare war anymore. There's no goal, no enemy, no treaty, no end, no beginning. But for now, it's in this context of war, loss, counting, backtracking, insurrection, and suffering, of boredom and solitude, that I will try to tell you what I know about music and life. So, first of all, I believe in angels. And I also love the Buddhist concept of the jewel tree. And it's the great teacher and Buddhist thinker Bob Thurman who describes this tree the best. And now this is a tree that you can conjure up in front of you, and on it are all the people you love and admire from eras of all time, real and imaginary, and they're all up there on the tree like jewels. And people who are capable of great insights or great love or ingenuity or whatever it is you're looking for, and they are all on your side. They are there explicitly to help you. But you don't have to be a Buddhist to picture this group of the greatest people from all time according to you. So you just pick them and you put them up there, and they are there for you, ready to advise you, to console you, to educate you. They have really nothing better to do at this point. Maybe. And then there are also the people who hang out over your shoulder, whisper in your ear, or maybe actually live somewhere in the back of your head. For me, my husband Lou Reed is one of these people and one of these voices. And he was my partner for a third of my life and my best friend. And he died in 2013, 8 years ago. But his words are still around. When I was 26, I decided to stay in bed until I could think of a really good reason to get up. I stayed in bed for months, and I would just lie there and look at the sky and sort of drift. At the time, I could afford to do this because I taught at night school, mostly accountants and secretaries who were on the slow track, going to school 2 nights a week for about 10 years. So I didn't have to get to work until around 6 in the evening, and mostly the people in the class were really late anyway, or just like way too tired to concentrate. Now, I was teaching Egyptian architecture and Assyrian sculpture, but I wasn't really keeping up with the Egyptological journals. So a slide would come up in class, and I would look at it, and I would just draw a complete blank. I couldn't remember a single thing about it. So I would just make things up about this or that pharaoh, and the students would write it down, and I would test them on it. Now, I figured that so much of history is speculation anyway, that it was maybe important to design theories for certain unexplainable things. Like, in some of the pyramids, there are these holes in the exterior, the shape of mailbox slots, and they were connected by a long shaft that ran at an odd angle down into the core of the pyramid, down into the mummy's chamber. And nobody knew why the shafts were there. And so what I told the students was that the slots and shafts were oriented to the sun, so that on only one day a year, let's say for the sake of argument, the mummy's birthday, the sun would stream down the shaft and into the inner chamber and shine into the mummy's eyes and wake him up. Now, eventually, I did feel a bit of guilt about this, since this was supposedly a history course and not, free-form fiction. So I quit. Not before I was fired, but it was very, very close. So here I am, many years later, wondering where this is going, what to do next. And then, just last week, I got an email from a library in Venice, and I have a library card at the Carini, because when I'm in Venice, at the film festival, it's such a non-stop, frantic party that I just needed a very quiet place to escape. The email subject line was, "C'era una volta la peste." Once upon a time, there was a plague. And it included a link to give you perspective on quarantines and the plague, and it offered maps about the way the plague spread, and books about the causes of the plague and the Black Death, and essays on the various lengths of the quarantines. And I loved looking at these pictures, those beaks that the doctors wore, and all the attempted cures, and the way people just deserted the cities for the country. And what would it be like after the plague? What will the world look like after you step back into it? And I'm thinking of Venice, with its streets of water, where every road is a river. And it's a city where you're always arriving and always leaving, stepping out onto the water, and then back onto the land. A city of flow. Nothing solid under your feet. I really love the phrase, the withness of the body. Withness, it's a phrase, a concept of Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote about the ever-present nature of the body. And I love the way withness sounds like witness, since, of course, you're your own best witness. And the withness of the body is also the subtitle of Delmore Schwartz's poem, The Heavy Bear Who Goes With Me, in which the body is described as the hungry, beating, brutish one, in love with candy, anger, and sleep. This body you're stuck with, always there lumbering along beside you, your sidekick, there every night, breathing at your side. You know, Lou had a really great way of figuring out what was good. It was his left arm. And when he heard music that really got to him, first he would laugh, and he had this laugh of a completely insane person. He started out as a kind of a howl, and it had lots and lots of notes in it as it went up, and then it just kind of ended in this big, deep, complicated chord. And it was really his own piece of sort of experimental music. And then next, he'd roll up his sleeve, and he'd point to his arm, and he'd say, "See, that's what I'm talking about." And his arm was completely covered with goosebumps. Now, my own reactions to hearing music or seeing dance or theater that I really love is the almost irresistible urge that I have to leave as soon as possible. To run out of the theater or the concert hall and out into the street. I can't stop myself. I just run out, almost as if I need to check how the world looks in this new light of what I just saw or what I just heard, and I don't even know why I'm doing that. It's just the body, and the body just starts to run. And I want to tell you a story from a long time ago, 1977. And I was talking to a friend, and he was saying he'd been having a lot of trouble concentrating, and that he'd just done a 10-day silent meditation retreat, and that after the retreat, his mind was like a beam, and he could move it from one thing to another, and all the chatter and crosstalk had just stopped. And I thought, that sounds great. I want a mind like a beam. So I went to a place called the Insight Meditation Society in Barrie in western Massachusetts. And it was in an old converted monastery. And when I arrived, there was a very short check-in orientation, and the greeter said, "Okay, you're here because you're in pain." And I said, "No, I'm here to get a mind like a beam." And he said, no, it's pain. And I said, "Beam." And it was back and forth like this, beam, pain. And I said, this is a very bad way to start, with an argument at a Buddhist center. But the form of Buddhism they were doing in Barrie was called Vipassana, and it's a relatively new form from the Thai forest tradition. And one of the aspects of Vipassana is that it's based on pain and how you store it. So for example, when something bad happens to you and you don't immediately scream, you put it somewhere and it stays there and you have to find it. Now, with psychoanalysis, you sometimes try to retrieve forgotten painful experiences through talking, through language. This never worked for me. I could always just make up a story about it. But the body is something else. The body doesn't really know how to lie. Anyway, we meditated for 18 hours a day. Each day began at 4 in total silence. And then we meditated for a couple of hours, then we walked, then we meditated some more, and we only had one meal a day. It was more hardcore then than it is now. And the only sound were these gongs ringing to mark the beginning and the end of each session. In fact, hearing and listening were a big part of these meditation days, listening for things like the way things end, the way sounds begin, and the way things can just keep ringing and ringing and ringing. And as you sat there, lots of things happened. After 3 hours, it feels like your left leg has been amputated and your right shoulder blade has been yanked off and stuck back on the wrong way. And as you feel this pain, you gradually realize that it's connected to emotions from the past. The thing that was so amazing was how organized it was. The way this pain is stored is so elegant, so precise. Loss and sadness you literally feel in your heart. Anger in your jaw, fury in your liver, panic in your legs. You're a library of pain, all filed, all perfectly coded. Now, there are ways to escape from this particular library, but that's a longer story, and so for now, let's just say that your body often knows more than you do, and when your body speaks its mind, it's important to listen. Now, in preparation for these talks, I was looking back over some old performances, and I just recently realized that a lot of them start the same way, with the river. I live by the Hudson River, so on, and like setting the scene for a play. Now, I've lived by the Hudson for most of my life as an artist, and it's been the subject of a lot of my music, and its rhythms have seeped into that too. Now, there's always something happening out on the river. There was the day the 5 kayakers got sucked under the ocean liner and then they popped up on the other side, and all the early spring days when the ice melts and the police boats troll around the rotten pylons in the piers looking for the bodies of the drowned who'd gotten caught there on their last stop as they were being carried out to sea. And in the 70s, there were whistles of tugs and ocean liners, and in the fall of 2001, there was the constant low rumble of truck convoys as they carried away the debris from the Trade Center. And it was that year when my assistant said she would quit if I didn't get a large inflatable raft that she could blow up and use to paddle across the river to safety in Jersey. Now, this is not frothy, fresh seawater. The river is full of antidepressants and antibiotics and Prozac and all kinds of drugs. And by the way, you may not be aware of this, but one of the main forms of sea life in the Hudson is the seahorse. And not the bright blue iridescent Caribbean variety, but a really funky kind of grayish brown New York color. Well, for years, my studio was a 5-minute downriver trip from Lou's studio, and we kept our cameras and telescopes on the windowsills, trained at the river in what we called America, over on the other side of the water. And we were always ready to shoot, and he'd call me up and say things like, especially about great sunsets, big one right now, get out there, such a weird orange. And one morning, Lou called and said, run to the window right now. There's a plane in the river, and it's on its way downtown, and I can see people standing out on the wings. January 15th, 2009. Now, in preparing for these talks, I realized something so weird and yet so obvious that I just couldn't believe that I hadn't seen it before. And that's that most of the big projects that I've done have somehow been about disasters on the water, and about things like doomed ships and sinking planes and planes crashing in the ocean. And there was Moby Dick and Amelia Earhart and a quartet called Landfall about Hurricane Sandy. And it's so strange. I mean, how could I have done so many of these things without actually realizing what I was doing? So you make these things, you write them, you record them, and how can you tell if any of it is any good? Or if it means something to other people? Now, a while ago, I worked on a record called Bright Red with Brian Eno in my studio here in New York, and at the time, the windows faced the Hudson River, and we often used the river as a way of editing the record. We would record some things, and then listened back while we stared at the river. And it became a way to see if the music was, let's call it, working. Whatever it was doing, whether the river was choppy or smooth or murky or covered with brightly lit white caps, there was something about watching the motion of the water that just taught us things about how to use the right combination of planned and spontaneous, just really how to flow. Now, maybe it was just a way of emptying our minds and focusing on the sound, but Brian made a motto for editing that record, which was, if it goes with the river, it goes on the record. Now, the last time I made a record with Brian was in 2016 in Copenhagen, and we played for most of the morning, and then we had lunch, and then we did what I never do. We sat down and listened in real time to what we recorded in the morning. And that's when I discovered that I didn't know how to play and listen at the same time, and that listening is really at least half of playing. Now, for the last year, the river has been empty. Only some tugboats, a few barges, once in a while a kayak. No ferries, water taxis, or cruise ships. No more all-you-can-eat voyages on their way in and out of the city. But for years, I would wake up at exactly 5:30 a.m., just at the exact moment when they passed, these cruise ships. I'd open my eyes and there they'd be. A cruise ship is filling my window, looking like a skyscraper that had fallen into the water and was drifting out to sea. I'm not exactly sure what woke me up. Maybe the very low subsonic vibration of the engines, or maybe the feeling that something really enormous was right nearby. The way our ancestors could tell, without looking, if there was a dinosaur standing right behind them. And we have inherited this. And I'm thinking of the way we can be in an elevator and get the very clear feeling that there's someone right behind you, someone who does not wish you well, maybe someone with a knife or a gun, and all the hair on the back of your neck starts to stand up. And it's the body, the things that we can understand through the body. The cruise ship, the dinosaur. Does everything have a dream version of itself? Do roads? Do rivers? I wake up at dawn. He's here, back from a star where he's been living. I'm fine, he always says. Couldn't be better. We have a short conversation and then he disappears for the 1,000th time, traveling back out over the water. How do you tell whether music is good or not? It has to feel alive somehow. And I'm thinking now of Dogen, 13th century Japanese Zen master who wrote a book called Enlightenment Unfolds. And it's full of questions. Like, are mountains aware? What in nature has consciousness? And what does not? We're listening right now to something called Move Your Heart. And it's part of a long piece of music called Hudson River Meditation Music, which Lou made from recordings of the wind over the river. And he processed the wind a few times and then arranged the sounds in layers, kind of like clouds. And he made this music to listen to while he practiced Tai Chi. Now, I've heard this many thousands of times now because it's become the music that we use in Tai Chi practice. And it never seems to repeat itself, although it does. And somehow it helps you pay attention to the complexity of the forms in Tai Chi. But it's music that you literally move through, and it reminds you that you live and move in an ocean of sound. Our teacher starts every class with the words, "Listen behind you." And suddenly, the world doubles and opens up as you feel all that space behind you. Feel it in the back of your neck, in your body, in your hands. You feel the chi. And the forms have such beautiful names. Part the wild horse's mane, push hands, cloud hands, and of course, the cannon fist punch. The punch. You know, Brian Eno said that new music is about new ways to listen. And I've thought about that a lot. And the music I listened to as a young artist in New York was a collection of minimalism and loops and feedback and drones, ambience, made by so many different composers, among them Phil Glass, Terry Riley, Pauline Oliveras, Steve Reich, Eliane Radigue, Lamont Young, and later William Basinski became part of this stream. Now, much of this music was in an utterly different time, outside of beats and bars. It's music that seems not to stop time, but really to ignore it completely. Now, the term ambient music is credited to Brian Eno, and I asked Brian why he chose what seemed like a spatial word for music that stops time, and he answered this with a comment on the fade-out in pop songs. Brian said, "A fade-out gives the impression that somewhere the music is still going on. It suggests an eternal music." And that was important to me, the thought of the music always existing and the record being a capture of a little part of its existence. I didn't want boundaries on the music. I wanted to have the feeling that I was stepping into a river of sound and that it would continue when I stepped out of it. Anyway, the idea is that the music goes on after the fade out. It goes on after you leave. It just keeps going on and on and on and on. And on. You know, when I think of stories and rivers, I think of one of my favorite books as a child called Wind in the Willows. And it's stories about all these characters, a mole, a rat and toad and a badger, who lived in little underground houses along the riverbank. And they drive little small cars, and they're always getting together for picnics, and they spend a lot of time, as they put it, messing about in boats. And they're all basically these bachelors in bathrobes and slippers, and pretty eccentric old guys, really. And it's amazing how children could really relate to them. And there's a strange chapter called Pipers at the Gate of Dawn. And Rat and Mole take a walk at dawn, and they see the river in the moonlight. And then they watch the moon disappear up into the cloudless morning sky. And as this happens, they heard, or maybe they hallucinated, a beautiful piece of music. This episode sounded a lot like a psychedelic trip, really. Rat and Mole were totally changed by hearing this sound. And I remember something that Rat said, and he said it was so beautiful that I almost wish that I'd never heard it. A bird piped suddenly and was still. A light breeze sprang up and set the reeds and bulrushes rustling. Rat, who was in the stern of the boat, while Mole sculled, sat up suddenly and listened with passionate intentness. "It's gone," sighed the rat, sinking back in his seat again. "So beautiful and strange and new. Since it was to end so soon, I almost wish I'd never heard it, for it roused a longing in me that is pain, and nothing seems worthwhile but just to hear that sound once more and to go on listening forever. No, there it is again," he cried, alert once more. Entranced, he was silent for a long space, spellbound. So, okay, we're coming to the end of the river, part 1 of the series. But there's one more thing I want to show you before we go over to the conversation Q&A part. And I've always wanted to sing like a violin, so I found a way to do this. And this little device is called a pillow speaker, and it's a small speaker that you put under your pillow at night so that you can do things like learn German in your sleep. This never worked for me. I just woke up feeling really paranoid. Anyway, being a somewhat oral person, I have to say that I really enjoy putting electronics in my mouth. So this is the way this works. A while ago, I went to Florida to get an award in an electronic music festival there. And instead of a speech, I decided to use this speaker. So I was rehearsing in my hotel, and the speaker seems to have been a little bit old because as soon as I put it on my mouth, the acid leaked out, and the speaker glued itself to the roof of my mouth. And I couldn't believe it. I thought the battery acid is going to dissolve the roof of my mouth. And I ran out of the hotel and I found a drugstore and I raced into the pharmacy in the back with this cable hanging out of my mouth. And I'm pointing to it saying, gesturing to the pharmacist, And I'm pretty sure this pharmacist had seen a lot of people running through that door with, things lodged into various parts of their bodies. So he didn't say anything, really. He just got a Q-tip and some alcohol, and he just pried it out and handed it back to me. No comment. So now we're going over to you in Boston to start the conversation part of this evening. And thank you so much for listening. Be right back.